A hand struck stone. Dust shivered across the rim and a round edge lifted clear. Workers shouted and retreated when the slab rolled away to reveal a perfect circular aperture carved through the observatory's center. Patch of black sat inside that circle and refused the torchlight. The archivist moved past the foreman and did not step back. Suspicion drove him forward. The angle of his shoulders and the way he set the leather folio on a nearby crate showed it. The team's shock was the first problem. They would not operate while fear stood between hand and tool. The first 5 sentences laid out what everyone saw and what the archivist felt. He did not say, "I am an archivist." Instead, he thumbed the folio open to a page mapped with inked diagrams and measured the aperture with a cold brass rule. He counted the relation of carved runes to perimeter stones. He recorded a single line: aperture diameter exact, internal surface texture basalt tool marks, observed interior no reflected light. That record kept the immediate conflict concrete. Whether this structure was designed to watch nothing or whether something had been summoned by careless digging. The foreman, a man called Jaw, said, "Stop. We close it now." His voice quivered, and he had not been a timid man before the excavation. Just stepped away from the rim, palms open to show he meant no equipment. "Workers, back up." The archivist, "Wait." He tapped the folio with his thumb, and his thumb left a pale crescent of dust. The suspicion in him shifted toward methodical curiosity. He wanted a test he could repeat. This movement from suspicion to deliberate testing determined his next orders. At the workbench under a tarpaulin, acolyte Mira set brass fittings on a wooden jig. "Mira, show me the sighting." The archivist. Her hands did not tremble when she bent the brass sight into position. She slid mirrors and an etched lens into the tube and pointed it at the aperture. The instrument, a narrow brass staff with polished discs, was small and precise. Mira tightened a screw, looked through the monocle, and then jerked her head back. "It shows nothing," she said plainly. "No glare, no star, no reflection." Her voice flinched on the word nothing, as if saying it aloud risked making it act. Juiced Ravel, crouched at the manuscript table, came up with a frown and a box of paper clamps. He had been hired to authenticate texts and to insist on proper restraint. "We must not perform or write against directions." Dura. Ravel and set a clamp on the brittle fragment. "We contain. We catalogue. We do not interact." His speech was clipped and his vocabulary was technical. His tone suggested a man who preferred measures to miracles. The local elder, Kesh, arrived with clay-stained hands and the smell of cooking embers on his garments. Kesh stood at the periphery and did not look at the aperture directly. He tapped the flat of his palm against his thigh and said, "Compasses fail." Neighbors watched, and they stopped speaking of the night. He was a man who used names and single concrete observations. His report changed the nature of the danger from a laboratory oddity into a social hazard. Mira placed the staff's polished disc within the aperture's rim and recorded an empty reading on a small slate. "The mirror shows my face, but not the void," she said. She placed a small bronze rod into the aperture and the rod vanished 5 centimeters beyond the rim. It made no sound as it slipped away. The workers drew a breath like a group inhale and then released it at the same time. The archivist felt that breath as data. He instructed Jor to lower a longer measuring rod, and Jor obeyed with hands that did not quite steady. The rod disappeared at a clean right angle past the opening. Instruments failed to find the rod beyond the rim. Charts that should show continuity plotted flat. That morning turned measurements into a chain of questions. The archivist sat with Durer. Ravel over the manuscript fragments beneath the tent. He read passages aloud while his finger held the line. On the day the watchers turned their eyes inward, he read, "The circle would be made to proof absence and sign." Jutra. Ravel slammed a palm on the table. "No, that text prescribes sealing. It prescribes closing, not watching." They bound voids to stop them. The argument between the two men escalated from a technical dispute to an ethical clash in less than 4 lines. Durer. Ravel, this fragment uses measurement terms. It charts angles and times. The archivist, it lists tools. He shifted the folio to face the daylight coming through the tent flap. It reads like an observatory ledger. Not a ledger for seals, He tapped his brass monocle on the folio. "Look at the notation here." "The blank column, it's deliberate," Jutta Ravel answered. "You read blank as permission. I read blank as omitted danger." They crossed it out because they feared it. The two men exchanged 6 short, tight sentences. The back and forth revealed their difference. The archivist's voice leaned toward engineers and instruments. Jutta Ravel's voice carried an institutional caution. At the village edge, Elder Kesh, a different kind of story to one of the workers, Muto, near a smoke, warm hearth. "Kesh, my aunt watched the sky there, and the rooster would not crow the next day." Muto blinked and answered, "Kesh, people here do not tell tales for nothing." Kesh described details. "The neighbor's lantern went dead, and the neighbor went to the well and never returned." These were not metaphors. Each sentence contained a concrete, reportable behavior. Kesh's narrative shifted the site's work from a matter of science to a matter of safety. Hearing it, 2 workers left their tools standing and walked away from the rim. By noon, the aperture had produced a public problem. Compasses failed near the rim. An alidade spun with no anchor. A measuring rod lowered from a pulley disappeared. Jutta Ravel wrote down the sequence and underlined the words, "Instrument failure," 3 times. The foreman, Jaw, raised his voice, and the camp split into people who wanted closure and people who wanted to leave. "Seal it, Jaw," said one worker. "We cannot know what to do," Jaw answered. "We finish the log. We mark coordinates. We do not dig more." That decision did not satisfy Mira. Mira pressed on. She wanted a small, contained rite that would test whether the aperture produced signals. "Give me the brass lens," she said. "Let me try an observation ritual, paired to instruments only." Ravel cut the air with a hand. "No, you cannot perform ritual here. We are scientists in the field." Mira's jaw tightened. She folded herself into the practical posture of someone used to being denied. The archivist inhaled through his teeth and made a choice that revealed the next emotion shift, from curiosity to restless resolve. He answered, "Mira will record it. We will not call it ritual. We will call it an observational protocol." The 2 men clashed across 3 terse exchanges that set the camp's next move. Mira arranged brass and mirrors, and the archivist stood beside her to record every adjustment with his pen. She whispered no words, only set the instrument. She did not perform a song or a chant. She rotated a disc and shielded one eye against the reflected torchlight. On the slate she wrote the time, the angle, the exact displacement of each mirror. Jutta Ravel watched like a man watching machinery he half understood. "If this produces an effect, we catalogue, then seal." The archivist nodded and placed a small tally mark beneath the time. When Mira opened the shutter to the aperture, the sky above the observatory bent into an impossible small circle of deepening dark. The air around them did not change temperature, but the way objects registered light did. A ring of stars that should have been visible through the aperture held steady, and then a band of sky within that ring went utterly blank. The workers gasped. The archivist's pen stopped. Just swore. Kesh dragged his finger along the seam of his palm in a measure that meant he would not speak what he had seen. The shutter decision became the chapter's real test. The archivist had to choose whether to expose the core or to seal it. He chose exposure. The reasons unfolded in short, consequential moves. The manuscript had been ambiguous, instruments had failed in patterned ways, and a controlled observation might produce repeatable data. He had a second motive he did not voice, an obsessive need to map the logic behind the observatory's focus on absence. That need had started as suspicion and had become a deliberate tool. His choice counted as action and also as risk. The aperture's dark patch expanded as if someone had cut a slit in the sky. A measuring rod lowered by Jar vanished 3 hand widths below the rim. A brass mirror aimed into the circle reflected only the back of Mira's knuckles. The archivist leaned over the rim and watched the surface of the void as an engineer watches a gauge. He felt a tremor in his fingers and he covered it by gripping the folio. His physical reaction, not a descriptive metaphor, showed his fear. Record the time. Note the coordinates. He hit twice, once for the slate and once so that the camp would obey. Jutta Ravel acted. He stepped toward the aperture with clamps and a roll of sealing cloth. "We will seal now." he said, and started to fasten the first clamp. Mira slammed her palm onto the table. No, you will close it and we will lose data. We will never know if the void moves on a schedule. She spat the words and they landed as practical counters to Ravel's order. The demands became sharp. Ravel insisted on containment. Mira insisted on measurement. Jo wanted to follow procedure. The archivist interrupted with a brief line that settled the immediate decision in an empirical way. One more test. Time limited. 1 minute, he set the brass timer on the bench and it began to wind. The minute lasted a long, tight sequence. The aperture did not move physically. Nothing was seen to approach or withdraw, yet small, testable anomalies multiplied. A mason's hammer left by the rim recorded a tick on a suspended thread, and then the thread snapped without a discernible gust. A small pool of water near the rim developed a meniscus that seemed to absorb the moon's reflection. The archivist wrote each observation in short sentences that read like lab notes. Hammer thread snap, no wind detected. Water meniscus absorption of moon reflection, no change in water chemistry detected in quick test. He ordered a sample of the water taken and placed on a copper dish. When the copper dish was brought within 3 hand widths of the rim, the water's reflection failed to appear, though the water itself did not vanish. That specificity tightened the terrible logic. The aperture altered optical return without altering mass in the immediate tests. Kesh pointed out a detail that shifted understanding. They did not carve the stone to let nothing in, he said. They carved it to measure when nothing is there. He spoke in short, local sentences. They watched absence like a clock. They read the lack of light as a message. His phrasing carried a concrete claim about motive. The archivist circled that idea in his notes. He then pushed the investigation further and asked Mira to set the mirrors to capture any indirect reflection. She angled a convex disc, checking the angle with a lead weight and a string mirror set to 7 degrees. Mira ready. She lifted her face and the archivist saw her jaw flex. 2 emotion shifts had already occurred in his posture, from suspicion to controlled curiosity and now to guarded fear. An unexpected discovery produced a mid-chapter cliffhanger. As Mira stepped back, a section of manuscript that had been clipped under a paperweight revealed another line. The small scrap had been tucked beneath the folio and the weight had shifted. The newly revealed line had ink that ran inward and then an angular strike through one sentence. The archivist read aloud a single guarded clause. When the watchers turned, they drew a circle where the stars refused to trade light. Dare. Ravel snatched the scrap and held it to the light. This line was redacted by a second hand. See the tiny strokes over the words. He then found an insertion beneath the strike. A marginal note in a different hand that read, shut at dusk, open at moonrise, tally absence. The note forced a new analysis. Someone had both used and attempted to hide procedural instructions about timing. The camp's posture shifted into suspicion of previous operators rather than of mere architecture. After that reveal, Jor stepped toward the tent with a worried expression. Who sealed this before? He asked. Who put instructions and then struck them out? Kesh answered. People fear being known. They cross out what they fear to forget a name. The exchange gave the team a concrete lead. The observatory had been used on cycles and then censured. That changed the archivist's strategy. He realized the observatory was not only a passive lens, it had an operational history with decisions made to hide its schedule. The revelation twisted the goal. They must not only measure the aperture now but reconstruct the prior operator's choices. Mira found a second physical trace. In the aperture's carved rim, just beneath the outermost rune band, a groove held a faintly oily residue that smelled of lamp oil and something metallic. She scraped a sliver and handed it to Jor Ravel. He ran a quick reagent test while Jor and 2 workers stood by. The reagent did not change color, but a magnet picked up a weak residue from the sample, iron filings and oil. Drar. Ravel announced. Someone used metal probing implements and lubricated them. They pulled something out and closed the aperture deliberately. The workers exchanged looks. That fact made the observatory an active tool in the past, not merely an architectural oddity. Tension rose in short, concrete acts. A young worker named Muto refused to stay near the rim and announced he would cook outside the gate. He picked up his kettle and left. Joe rounded up ropes and secured the area. Kesh walked to the village threshold and called 2 neighbors to keep watch. These were not atmospheric statements. They were small logistical choices that moved the plot and changed exposure. The archivist ordered copies of the manuscript and assigned Mira to drafting a precise observational protocol with times and angles. Mira, prepare a ledger template. Juta Ravel, you will run the regent tests. Jaw, you will maintain perimeter. Kesh, you will take local testimony at dawn. Each command occupied 1 line in his folio and 1 concrete action in camp life. The climax arrived at dusk. The archivist decided to operate the shutter and extend the observation window. He informed everyone with a single sentence. We open at dusk. We watch through the first hour of night. The motion of the shutter required cooperation. Joe braced the iron bar. Mira turned the gears. Ravel calibrated the clamps, and Kesh stood to signal if any village watchers approached. The gear turned with a metallic groan. The aperture now showed a broader field. Something in the ring of sky thinned, and a circle of unusual darkness expanded to contain an unlit patch that swallowed 3 familiar stars. The surrounding stars remained. Only a precise patch of sky withdrew light. When the dark patch settled, instruments reported anomalies that could be recorded. The chronometer logged the hour. The brass staff noted a discontinuity at 44 degrees. And a small mirror detached a speck of soot from its edge where no soot should have formed. That soot tested positive for carbon and a residue similar to the oily groove earlier. Juta Ravel recorded the soot in a glass field. He sealed it and, in front of everyone, wrote the sample number in block letters. We have material evidence, he said. We have oil and soot and a measured disruption of optical return. The words held the group's attention because they were concrete proof. A new twist reshaped motive. While transcribing, the archivist found that the counting column in the ledger had been used to mark absence rather than presence. He read aloud the ledger's last entry and realized its implication. Prior watchers counted the intervals when light failed and treated those counts as omens to be acted upon. They recorded absence as signal, he said. They treated absence as instruction. The idea was specific and chilling. It explained local behavior. It explained why neighbors avoided the place. The observers had used the aperture to know when to act. Night deepened and the team catalogued their measurements. The archivist placed a new tally in the folio and then, with precise gestures, he slid the folio into a small chest and locked it. We archive this under observed absences. Code Red 7. The act of naming and locking the chest was a practical closure. Kesh backed away toward the village and told 2 neighbors, do not let travelers pass this way at moonrise. He spoke in measured, actionable terms. Mira stood with folded arms and let the instruments rest. Ravel lingered by the feel and rotated it between thumb and forefinger, eyes narrow with counting and calculation. That final sequence resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. They had measured, they had recorded material evidence, and they had decided on a constrained containment protocol. The aftermath was procedural and concrete. The archivist wrote an entry that described the shutter's operation, the regents used, the exact coordinates of the aperture, the time intervals when absence occurred, and the marginal note that had been uncovered. He did not add moralizing lines. He closed the folio with a stamp and sealed the chest with beeswax. He then went to the rim and felt the carved stone under his palm to confirm that the tool marks matched his notes. Kesh stood beside him and said nothing. His silence meant he would tell the village the details in plain terms. Before they left, the archivist copied the marginal insertion into a separate folio and underlined the phrase, "Tolly absence." He closed the folio and looked at Mira. "We will not perform further rites," he said. "We will not remove anything more tonight." Mira nodded and turned her face away for a second, flexing her jaw as if to release an unspoken urge. Juta Ravel boxed the samples and wrote chain of custody notes. Jaw organized the ropes. Each action reduced immediate danger and raised the larger problem. Why had previous watchers treated absence as an instruction? The team had shifted from simple curiosity to disciplined containment, and an urgent need to reconstruct prior practice. They left the aperture shutter slightly ajar under an agreed notation. Observe only at first moonrise, limit exposure to 1 hour, send 2 witnesses. That specific operational decision ended the chapter's mini-conflict. The archivist walked back to the tent, set the folio on the bench, and added one last note in a tidy hand. Redaction present. Scheduling intentional. Further research required on societal response. He then closed the folio, placed it in the chest, and ordered the chest sealed. The chest's lock clicked. That click ended the immediate story in concrete terms. Outside the tent, Kesh called to 2 neighbors and gave them a list of instructions. Note any missing people, record any compass failures, and report any unusual soot on hearths. He spelled out times and actions. The archivist listened as the neighbors repeated the list back in simple phrases. The final paragraph of the chapter ties the narrative to a physical beat. Mira locked the instruments into a crate, Jo hung the ropes on a peg, and Jo Ravel set the sealed file into a padded case and handed it to the archivist. The archivist took it, placed it into the chest, and snapped the lock shut with a final, precise movement. That movement closed the chapter on a concrete, situational beat directly connected to the events just described. Emotion root. Suspicion. The archivist's suspicion motivated every choice from the first strike to the final seal. Emotion shifts occurred repeatedly. Suspicion shifted into controlled curiosity when measurement began. Curiosity shifted into guarded fear when instruments failed. And fear shifted into disciplined containment as physical evidence accumulated. The chapter contains at least 2 named secondary characters, acolyte Mira, Jo Ravel, Jo, and local elder Kesh, each appearing in several scenes and altering the direction of action. Dialogue drives discoveries and confrontations, and every external event, the uncovered aperture, the vanishing rod, the revealed marginal note, the suit sample, appears within 3 to 5 paragraphs to sustain momentum. The chapter ends with a final, concrete action. The archivist closes the chest and hands the sealed case to the camp's courier, an act that resolves the immediate conflict and prepares the team for further investigation. The lantern vanished into black and the men stumbled back. The archivist stepped forward, suspicion threaded through his movements, and he crouched at the rim to write the first line in his folio. Joran saw behind him. Mara spat a breath that fogged the weak light. The immediate problem was plain. The aperture swallowed flame and refused to reflect any torch beam, and the team argued over whether to seal it or measure it further. He had seen the hand strike stone in Chapter 1. The memory of the slab rolling aside and the visible patch of black that refused a torch still sat in his folio notes. He touched that earlier record now, turning pages with the practiced thumb the excavators already knew, and he did not let the moment become reverie. His suspicion moved him toward experiment. Joran, we test it now. Joran answered, we seal it now. Lyra pulled him by the sleeve and said, we must see what it does. The argument formed like a pulley. Each pull changed the team's direction. The archivist smelled wet stone and iron and the faint ozone that hung near the aperture. He listened for the practical facts. The aperture's rim was cut true. The stone ring bore concentric scratches consistent with repeated mechanical movement, and the air at the edge carried a chill that made fingers clench. He did not say, I fear this. He moved into action. Suspicion guided him. He wanted to confirm whether the observatory recorded absence or light. They organized a test. Mara climbed a short ladder with the lantern and stood over the rim while Joran and 2 laborers braced the ladder's feet. The archivist held the brass monocle against his eye and timed the moment the flame reached the opening. Ready? Mara called. Her voice clipped. Lyra steadied Mara's elbow. Joran's jaw tightened. The lantern dipped. The wick touched the lip of black and the flame pinched out, not by wind but by an instant that lacked air and light together. The lantern's glow stopped a finger's width from the aperture and died. Silence snapped. One of the laborers muttered, It took it. Joran swore again and stepped forward with the intention to cover the hole. Mara pulled back, breathless. The archivist did not raise his voice. He recorded time, distance, ladder angle, the make of the wick, and the scent of the fuel. He made no pronouncements beyond facts, because facts were his tool for translating suspicion into evidence. At the makeshift camp below the rim, voices rose. Joran's voice carried the blunt authority of a foreman. "We bury it. We can't have men near that thing." He paced and struck the heel of his hand on a crate. "This is dangerous. We leave it sealed." Mara put her palms on her knees and kept her breathing even. "We don't leave a mechanism unknown. We find its purpose." Lyra held a sheet of canvas and arranged instruments. She spoke quietly but with force. "If it is a measurement device, destroying it destroys knowledge." Their lines crossed and caught. The archivist walked between them with his folio open and a brass pencil balanced. He read aloud the entry about the aperture. "The ring is carved to rotate. The slab moves smoothly on recessed channels." His voice was low, precise. He pointed to a sketch. "This structure aligns to a patch of sky, but its core rejects light. That makes it a measuring device for absence, not sight." Joran barked. "That's superstition dressed as science." "Mara, you always have room for superstition." Joran. "This is a machine, Lyra. We have to look under the tarp." They argued until the early chill turned to pale morning, and then they lifted the tarp. Under canvas, brass caught the dawn and reflected a thin slice of the camp. The instrument lay like a folded language. A brass plate with tiny mirrors and etched runes, a chart rolled next to it with inverted markings, and a set of adjustment screws stamped with a sigil none of them recognized. The mirrors did not show the camp. They reflected a small, clean patch of darkness that had its own boundary. "Lyra, it reflects nothing. See." She touched a tiny mirror and her finger did not leave an oily smear. Instead, a cold ring circled where her skin had been a moment before. The archivist's hand hovered over the instrument. He noted the etched chart with inverted coordinates, and the way the screws were calibrated to subtract rather than magnify. He repeated aloud what he saw. "These mirrors are aligned to map voids. The chart marks absence with the same precision as a star chart marks light." "Mara, you're certain?" He answered, "Not certain. But this is a device for negative observation." Suspicion shifted into focused hypothesis. His movements shortened and sharpened. They had not yet reached consensus when Elder Aradin arrived. He walked up the path with 2 attendants and a single servant bearing a bound folio. Aradin's arrival inserted a new motion into the day's argument. He did not speak until he stood before the aperture and the brass instrument. Then he set the folio on a flat stone and opened to a page with handwriting different from the team's copies. "You profane what should be watched, Aradin." His voice did not waver. He called Mara by her name and Joran by his, and the men flinched. "You must leave it sealed. The guardians will answer any disturbance with the old rites." Joran clenched his hands and answered, "You will not order my men away, Aradin." Lyra stepped between them quickly. "We have rights to research, Elder." Aradin touched the folded chart and said, "Then show me what you found first. Show me how you mean to measure an absence." The archivist accepted the bound folio with slow reverence and turned its fragile pages. He had anticipated ritual claims. He had not expected this folio to contain a note in a hand he recognized from earlier marginalia. An editor's hand the archivist had seen in a ledger purchased 2 months prior. He pointed at a line where the elder's notes contradicted the oral history that Aradin had offered the villagers. "This line says the aperture's purpose is to catalogue missing patterns in the sky to predict emission events, not to hide a monster, Elder," the archivist read. Aradin's expression tightened. "Those notes were annotative, not prescriptive," he said. He put his thumb on the sentence like a hinge. "My ancestors guarded the aperture. The people learned to fear. Fear protects." Joran spoke fast. "Fear doesn't feed men, Aradin. Work feeds men. We will not be driven away by old tales." Mara's reply was shorter. "We will measure it, or we leave knowledge to myth." The exchange hardened into a negotiation. Aradin formed a bargain, guardianship in exchange for measured access. He would not allow strangers to wander the rim unobserved, but he would permit the team to perform controlled experiments under elder supervision. Joran hesitated and then nodded. His men wanted to continue paid work, and the elder's presence promised stability. Lyra whispered to the archivist, "He keeps a fragment he will not let us scan," the archivist answered. "Then I take his page and compare it to my ledger. If they differ, we must trust the page that answers tests." He spoke like a man staking a claim with facts. They set the brass instrument on a low crate at the rim and adjusted its supports. Lyra read the inverted chart and handed screws to Mara. Mara, who had the steadiness of someone used to shifting stone, tightened bolts with a wrench and faced the aperture. "Tell me where to point," she said. "Point where the diagram marks a hollow," the archivist replied. He used the brass monocle to line up a tiny mirror and asked Mara to tilt the plate a fraction. She did so with careful mechanical breaths. Each adjustment produced new notches on the chart. The calibration began like clockwork. They marked 0 positions, then drew the mirrored plate until the etched coordinates matched the ring on the rim. Mara turned a screw and the instrument registered a faint negative trace on the chart, a thin black band that the chart called a negative arc. Read the scale, Lyra. Joran peered and muttered numbers. The trace deepened, small marks translating absence into ink strokes that the archivist's hand followed. As the instrument locked into place, something changed at the aperture edge. The patch of sky visible through the hole altered into a pattern that did not belong to the visible weather. A map of light had been expected. Instead, the aperture presented a precise, dark patch with a faint contour that suggested depth. Then the rim registered a tactile response, a pressure like fingers feeling the edge from the other side. Mara leaned forward to adjust the plate and her shoulders seized. She convulsed, not with pain but with reflex. Her fingers dug into the crate. Her boots scraped on packed earth. The archivist reached for her and found her hand cold. Her face had gone pale where the sun touched it.
Joran shouted, "Pull her back!"
He grabbed her forearms. Lyra wrapped a scarf around Mara's wrist. The archivist yanked and felt a mechanical tug, not wind, not muscle, but a pull from beyond the rim. He clamped a hand on Mara's belt and dragged her clear while her legs kicked at the ladder. Her eyelashes had frost along them. Mara gasped and spat salt onto the stone. She pushed a damp strand of hair from her mouth and said, "I felt a palm," she it in a voice that was both an observation and a warning. Joran's hands trembled in a way he did not show men who worked for him. We pull everything back." Now the archivist counted and set his folio flat, rapid lines of ink mapping each parameter of the incident. The instrument angle, the second when the pull began, Mara's position, and the exact point where her skin had gone cold. He noted these things because facts were the only lever he had against stories that would otherwise become fear. Elder Aradan watched without touching. He spoke at last. "This aperture answers. It will not be sealed without guardians. It will not be measured without sacrifice." Lyra shook her head. "Sacrifice," she said. Aradan did not repeat the word. Instead, he closed his folio and produced a thin paper with characters the archivist recognized as an alternate charting system. "The chart you found is incomplete. There are missing diagrams. The missing diagrams explain how to read the negative arcs without stirring the edge." He fixed his gaze on the archivist. "You should not have matched its setting without that diagram." A new motion occurred. The archivist checked his folio and found a torn margin where a diagram should be. He lifted the brass pendant from his neck, an etching of an empty circle he had worn for years, and its chain felt heavy. "A page is missing from my ledger. It should have been here. That is evidence of interference." Aradan's mouth tightened. "Pages are lost when things are not meant to be known. We are not strangers to loss." His retinue shifted. One of the attendants tightened his cloak as if at a remembered cold. Negotiations resumed in a narrower register. Aradan proposed secrecy and guardianship, Joran demanded paid work and safety for his men, and Mara insisted on controlled experiments and a promise to record data. The archivist proposed a compromise. Aradan's folio would stay open to the pages necessary for safe calibration, and the team would follow recorded procedures. In return, the elder would allow the archivist limited access to the aperture 3 times a week. Joran barked acceptance because labor was currency, Mara nodded because she wanted to test further, and Lyra mouthed to the archivist, "This buys us time." The archivist agreed reluctantly because time produced more facts. That afternoon they attempted a follow-up calibration with tighter constraints. The instrument produced more negative traces on its inverse chart, and Lyra began to overlay the elders' markings against their own. She squinted at the tiny script. "There are offsets here that the elders' script claims are ritual corrections," she said. "His chart suggests small offerings at measured intervals." The archivist looked up. "Offerings? As in objects placed at the rim?" Lyra answered. "Smaller things. Salt or white thread, the ember of a specific wood. The notes say those items stabilize a reading." The archivist's suspicion shifted again. Where it had been a question of measurement, it now took on the practical angle of ritual control. They did the offerings because the chart demanded procedure. Marek knelt with a pinch of salt and scattered it at the rim. Joran placed a cut of rope tied in a standard knot and spat to the ground. The instrument produced a cleaner trace. The aperture's edge warmed a fraction. The effect suggested cause and effect. "Lyra, these are calibrations. Ritual is part machine." Aradin watched and said, "Ritual remembers the right way to touch the mechanism." The archivist wrote, "Ritual as mechanical safeguard." He felt impatience fold into guarded acceptance. His hands moved with the precision of someone cataloging a machine, rather than someone surrendering to superstitions. As evening came on, the group settled into uneasy rhythms. The men repaired supports, Lyra cleaned mirror surfaces with stitched cloth, and Mara checked screws. Joran spoke quietly to the archivist and said, "Why do you keep that pendant on you?" The archivist set his folio down carefully and answered, "It marks my questions. I pin it where answers fail." Joran nodded and looked toward the aperture. "Don't lose that. Then, you might need it." The exchange was small but concrete. It placed objects as actors, pendant, folio, instrument, rather than metaphors. A new event broke the slow sequence. A laborer at the cliff below the camp shouted and pointed to the horizon. The sky there held a patch that did not match the rest. An unlit portion within the star field, a small area that registered as dark when everything around it glowed. The team ran out to the edge. The archivist drew the instrument up and aligned it. The mirrors registered the same pattern. Lyra's voice went thin. "Look, it's a patch of missing stars," Aradin whispered. "This is the map's language." The presence of a corresponding night anomaly confirmed the instrument's readings in a way that changed the problem from laboratory curiosity to a mapped phenomenon. That night they argued again, but with new facts. Joran spoke of safety and coins. Mara insisted on more tests. Aradin quietly told them of guardians who once kept watch because the patch correlated with absences elsewhere. Missing births, failed harvests, small disappearances in households a day after a dark patch. The archivist recorded each correlation and felt a coldness begin to name itself as fear in his posture. He kept his voice steady, but his hands brushed the folio harder. Before dawn, they planned a larger calibration with the instrument fully deployed and the elder standing guard at the path. The archivist insisted on repeated measurements and overlapping charts. "We do this in stages," he told them. Mara checked screws and said, "We'll need a steady hand on the plate and someone to read the offset marks." Joran assigned 2 men to hold the crates steady. Lyra prepared the charts and lit a single candle at the rim to mark the instrument's center. They aligned the instrument again, and the chart filled with negative traces that mapped strange consonances across the sky. The mirrors darkened to a denser black, and the aperture's edge hummed with an audible frequency like a low metallic ring. Mara leaned in to make a micro-adjustment, and the rim produced a sharper response, a silhouette pressed against the inner edge, like a palm leaving moisture on cold glass. Mara's knees locked. She inhaled and then tried to pull back, and the pull seized her across the belt this time. The team reacted faster. Joran lunged, the archivist threw his shoulder into her, and Lyra yanked at Mara's sleeves. For a breath the world narrowed to hands and the creak of boots. Mara's weight shifted and nearly tipped forward into the aperture. The archivist's fingers found the loop of her belt, and his forearm burned where the coldness met skin through cloth. He hauled and felt an odd mechanical resistance, like gear teeth grating at the edge of a wheel.
He shouted, "Hold her!" Hold her.
Men grabbed hands and boots. Mara's face drew tight and then slack as the force released. She collapsed and vomited a salty taste onto the stone. The elder knelt and laid a palm on her shoulder, murmured a phrase the archivist did not recognize, and the tremor in Mara's limbs eased. They retreated after that. Arden proposed secrecy and guardianship. Joran demanded recompense and a guarantee that men would not be drawn into danger again. Mara, breathing in short bursts, insisted on one last measure, a recorded reading of the pull that had nearly taken her. The archivist recorded everything. He wrote the angle, the instrument's calibration, and the precise instant the silhouette touched the rim. He set the brass monocle aside and pinned the pendant to the rim with a brass tack, where Mara had nearly gone beyond reach. At dusk, alone in his tent, the archivist sealed the brass instrument in a crate and set his ledger open. He compared Araden's folio, the team's charts, and the torn margin where a diagram should have been. He noticed that the elder's annotations shifted responsibility onto ritual, an instruction to stabilize readings by offerings, while the missing page in his own ledger had likely contained a mechanical diagram aligning screw tolerances to a safe range. The absence of that page changed interpretation. The archivist's suspicion now hardened into an accusation. Someone had removed a diagram that would have prevented interference. He closed his pen and counted the names he would write in his report. Joran, foreman and protector of labor. Mara, mechanic and steady hand who almost crossed the rim. Lyra, the assistant who read the charts. Elder Araden, the steward of ritual knowledge, and himself the archivist who translated evidence into testable claims. He rolled the folio and secured the brass instrument with leather straps. He slipped the pendant back around his neck, fingers smelling of ink and salt. When he re-entered the camp, the men had already made a low fire and spoke in clipped sentences about the day's events. Mara sat with a blanket around her shoulders and refused to drink. Joran argued quietly with an attendant about pay. Lyra hummed as she smoothed the edges of a mirror. Araden closed his folio and said, "Records will be kept in private. The guardians will watch the aperture." The archivist looked at the torn space in his ledger and then at Araden's sealed folio. He put the pendant against the rim and pressed it into a small crack where stone met mortar. Then he took it back and tied the chain around the entry page with a slip knot. "I will mark it where it is missing," he said. The men listened. "Joran, what will you do now?" The archivist answered, "I will follow the missing diagram." He would not declare heroics. He would not make promises he could not keep. He had facts and a plan to chase them. The final act of the chapter was a small, resolute motion. With the lantern banked, the elder's retinue blending into shadow at the approach, and the team gathered in the cold ring of the observatory. The archivist pinned the pendant to the rim, where the torn page's diagram should have referenced a safe offset. He closed his ledger over the day's entries and pressed the clasp shut. That closing was a decision. To guard the instrument's secrets with record, and to press onward until the missing page returned or someone else explained why it had been taken. The camp settled into tense quiet under the watch of an aperture that measured absence, and the archivist kept his pen uncapped beside his ledger, ready for the next event. Joran leaned over the rim and cried out. His knees buckled and his face went slack before his body hit the stone. Suspicion tightened in the archivist like a lead band, suspicion that measurement itself might draw harm. He shoved past the foreman, palms flat on cold rock, and pulled Joran away from the aperture as men shouted. Mara grabbed Joran's shoulders and shook him. "Breathe, Joran," she said, "listen to me." The aperture held a circle of absolute black at its center. The lantern flame had melted into that black in Chapter 1. The torchlight had vanished when the slab rolled away in the opening work Cruz had described. The archivist had read those lines in half, rotted reports, and seen them in the gouge of stone, but now the absence reached across muscle and bone and claimed a person. His hands smelled of dust and brass. His thumb rubbed the leather binding of the folio, where he had recorded the first measurements. He wrote one line in trembling script and stopped. "What happened?" Foreman Brenbach. He stood with his arms crossed, Cape wet from dew, jaw working. Did you bring him to the edge? He looked at Mara, then the archivist. We did this once. We must stop. He looked through the sight. Mara, it felt like hands, and then he went pale. She kept her voice short, urgent. He doesn't remember falling. He remembers the brass ring on the sight, and then waking up here. The archivist kept his pen poised above the folio. He could feel a change moving through the team. Practicality hardening into fear, method fraying into superstition. The change forced choices. He tested his own voice, stepped back. He told the crew, cover the opening, record everything. No more eyes through instruments until we confirm a procedure. His tone aimed to restore order. Bren's face tightened. You heard him. Bren, cover it now. We leave tonight. This is a cutting. I want to lose my men to an empty hole. He pushed toward the rim with his shoulder. Archivist, you can keep risking people for notes. Foreman Bren. The aperture is a phenomenon. We document. We limit exposure. We do not abandon the site because of fright. The archivist kept his reply clipped. He let the word phenomenon stand between the crew and pastition. His pen made a dry sound as he crossed a line in the folio. Joran coughed. His palms were chalk white. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. I remember brass, he said finally, voice raw. There was a ring on the sight. I looked for a seam, then nothing. I can't remember the seconds after the ring. Mara pressed the heel of her hand into Joran's shoulder. Joran, tell us if you see anything now. He blinked and tried to form the shapes of the room. I saw black. Then pulling, like a glove over my face. Then a sound like a paper tearing inside my head. The men around exchanged looks. The paper tearing phrase moved among them like a shared bruise. The argument then rose, short and hot, in the courtyard. Bren paced and used his hands to map risk. We do not test tonight, Bren. We dismantle what we have. We return to town. We cannot walk away. The archivist countered. We have a geometry. We can measure. We can learn what draws that black, and if it draws a man dead. Bren drove the question bluntly. What then, archivist? Will you write the death into your folio? I will not let superstition rule findings. The archivist, we will set protocols. We will name witnesses. We will anchor the site with mirrors and scales. He kept his voice even, but his fingers tapped the folio edge. Doubt in the camp hardened into two camps. Those who wanted to leave and those who wanted to continue. Mara glared at Bren, and then at the archivist. We can do both. We can slow down and test safer, she said. The team chose to remain for one night more. They set up a work circle on the rim and lowered brass mirrors and a sighting instrument that the archivist had prepared from old drawings. Deborah arrived just before midnight, coated in thin rain, carrying a brittle fragment of manuscript wrapped in oilcloth. She pushed past Bren's protest and demanded an audience with the archivist. Archivist, she said without ceremony, dropping the oilcloth onto the folio table. You are measuring the wrong thing. You are measuring absence without a name. The aperture answers named lack. Her voice carried a dry certainty that cut through the Crus division. Deborah's hands trembled when she smoothed the manuscript open. Ink had worn to pale strokes. I watched a child vanish at an opening once, she said. She called for her mother, and then there was a seam of black, and she was gone. That opening wanted a name. We spoke the child's name, and it did not move. We left a token. We sealed the rim. She kept her sentences short. You profane when you seek without naming. The archivist read the fragment under torchlight. Its calligraphy mapped lines of absence tied to ritual geometry, but the words were specific. Names, tokens, formal utterances. He felt a shift inside, suspicion folding into irritation, then into a prickling dread. Deborah, the manuscript is late. It might be local superstition. We must test systematically. He did not say that the manuscript matched a notation he had seen in a ledger from a distant library. Deborah's eyes narrowed. Systematic will burn the watchers. Your tests are blunt. This place answers intent, not instruments. If you insist on measuring without respect, you will find more than gaps. Mara stepped forward. Deborah, if your method prevents harm, tell us plainly what you would have us do. Deborah produced a brass token, a small disc etched with an empty circle. She held it as if it weighed more than metal. Name a thing, an absence you can point to, and place the token at the rim. Speak the form in a closed voice. Do not let others fix their eyes inside the aperture while the ritual proceeds. Bren barked. Ritual? No, we are builders and diggers. We are not priests. Then step back and leave. Deborah, do not watch while others speak of the absent. They argued in terse exchanges that kept to the rule. Quick lines, tasks defined, choices sharpened. Bren pressed for withdrawal, Mara for a compromise of mirrored observation. Joran avoided taking sides, fingers worrying the hem of his coat. They tested at prayer, dawn with mirrors braced on iron racks and the brass sighting instrument mounted on the rim. The archivist applied Devereux's method alongside his own measurements. He had the mirrors angled, runes etched around the aperture per Devereux's fragment, and a small token placed at the east edge of the rim. Devereux whispered names under her breath, syllables clipped, while the archivist recorded angular degrees and mirror refractions. As the calibration progressed, the aperture widened. The black expanded into a ring that ate the reflected torchlight off the mirrors. Mara felt the negative reach and stepped closer to the rim, hands open to steady a bracket. Her fingertips brushed the brass token. Mara, move back! Bren shouted. His voice scraped. He crossed to grab her wrist. The black reached a thin, perfect silhouette of a hand, negative of the shape at the rim, and that silhouette pinched at Mara's sleeve. The fabric creased inward as if something pulled from the far side. Mara froze, eyes wide, jaw set. The archivist saw the silhouette and chose. He could finish the measurement, record the degree of widening, note the angle at which the negative reached, or he could intervene to pull Mara back. His chest tightened into a decision. He lunged. He did not think of method then, he acted. He clasped Mara's forearm and hauled. The negative grabbed at her sleeve but could not take purchase on her skin. The seam between world and aperture slatted as if a hand had been closed. The rim spat a fine black dust across Mara's knuckles. Mara stumbled backward. Joran and Bren each grabbed a shoulder and hauled her inside, while Devereux shouted a short exclamation, and the mirrors vibrated from sudden motion. For a heartbeat no one spoke. The work circle smelled of metal, charred wick, and something like hot iron. Mara pressed the palm of her hand to her mouth. It pulled, she said. It pulled me. Bloodless ash dusted her skin. The archivist pulled up Mara's sleeve. There was a circular brass, colored imprint burned into the flesh of her palm, a ring of heat that looked stamped rather than burned. He ran his thumb across it. A smear of black came away. Devereux, the archivist, eyes fixed on the mark. What is this? Devereux's hands closed on the manuscript as if to steady herself. The token makes contact. It ties the absence to an intent. Some names hold, some do not. You forced the meeting of methods. You forced the aperture to widen. Bren spat. You named it, then it reached. You who talk of names, are you responsible for this? His voice had the brittle edge of accusation. Archivist, your notes led us here. Your insistence is why Mara nearly went in. Joran, who had been silent since he collapsed, bent forward until his face hovered near the folio. I can remember the seconds after the ring, he said again, but my right hand feels empty inside, like a glove was pulled out from it. I can explain it. Devereux's lips pressed into a line. You should not pry without naming. The manuscript says this. Absence that is unnamed will flail for a name in bodies that reach into it. The archivist's mind snapped between registers. Scientific procedure, ritual logic, and personal culpability. Suspicion had led him into the aperture's patterns. Now it curdled into responsibility. He looked at Mara's hand, and then at the aperture, which had shrunk back to a tight circle. Record the angle at which it widened, he said. Record the exact placement of the token and the sequence of syllables Devereux spoke. Note the ash on Mara's palm. Log Joran's loss of time. I will write it down. He set the folio open and began to write bullet points with quick, clean strokes. Outside the antechamber, Bren paced and called names. We should leave. We have a woman hurt and a man with no memory. This is not excavation, it's danger. He spoke with blunt, raw tone. Archivist, you made the call. Will you answer if it takes a man? The archivist did not immediately answer. He watched Mara cradle her burned palm and press the ring with a finger until it hurt. He watched Joran's hands continue to search for a seam in his own memory. He heard Devra rustle the manuscript and whisper a question into the page. Was she named? Devra's confession came 2 breaths later. She sat on a crate and folded her hands on her knees. I named a child once, and she did not leave my field of sight because I had tied a token to her name, she said. I thought we were respectful then. I thought tokens and names were enough, but names change with people. The child had an older brother who returned and called another name that night. The opening answered the second call and took the wrong thing. I have carried that since. Her words landed like a small slam. Faces turned toward her. The confession shifted moral authority. The archivist felt anger flare at himself for ignoring such knowledge earlier, and at Devra for withholding it until peril forced her hand. Why did you withhold that? He asked. Devra looked at him slowly. Because I thought the manuscript would be read where it belonged, not where hands were near the rim. I thought study would prevent harm. I thought wrong. That twist, Devra's admission that her own ritual had failed and that naming could misdirect absence, changed how the team understood earlier incidents. The archivist saw a new possibility. The aperture did not merely swallow light. It answered the directed call of attention and could be missiled by competing names. The ledger he remembered contained a notation about a sealed boy who shrank into the ground during a festival when 3 names were spoken at once. He had not linked it before. The new understanding sharpened the stakes. Mara's mark and Joran's memory gap were not accidental. They were responses to choices made at the rim. The argument lost its earlier binary. Bren still wanted distance. Devra wanted ritual specificity. The archivist wanted to reconcile both, method and named restraint. They argued in brisk turns. Bren insisting on leaving, Devra insisting on ritual containment, Mara urging cautious testing, Joran pleading for answers about his missing seconds. The exchanges were quick and grounded. Bren, if we leave now, we flee knowledge. The archivist, if we stay and follow protocol, we can limit exposure. He looked at Mara. Can you stand another test if we keep you safe? Mara flexed her fingers. I will stand if we do it the way Devra says, then measure precisely after. I will not be bait for experimentation. Bren ground his jaw. That's not a guarantee. You risk her again. You risk everyone if you refuse to learn, the archivist replied. He did not raise his voice. He used the folio's blank page as if it were a scale. They prepared a second calibration. This time the archivist wrote the syllables aloud into the folio first. Then Devra spoke them under her breath. They marked who would touch what token and who would keep eyes diverted. Joran volunteered to stand aside and maintain the ledger. His voice was thin but steady. Bren stood with his back to the rim, sleeves rolled, hands ready to haul anyone back. As dawn limned the horizon, they set mirrors to catch reflected sky rather than torchlight. The archivist set the brass sight so that its ring could not align at an unguarded angle. Devra pressed her palm to the token and muttered a name that belonged to no living thing. When she spoke, Mara tightened her fingers around the rail and steadied her breath. The aperture widened again, but this time it advanced only to the edge of the token and stopped. The negative silhouette reached partway and then shuddered, as if striking a taut cloth and losing traction. The mirrors trembled, reflecting a thin, hard black that did not swallow the flame. Mara kept her hand from the rim. Bren stepped forward and clapped both hands on the token, anchoring it with muscle. Relief did not come all at once. Devra's lips were white. Joran's face bore a new strain. The archivist wrote numbers and repeated them aloud. He compared angles and syllables. He compared the effect when the name matched an intent and when it was a misname. The pattern formed, not as a comforting law, but as a dangerous tool. The aperture answered directed absence bound by ritual phrasing. In the antechamber, the team argued gently over procedure, each line of dialogue short and practical. Bren volunteered 2 men for guard duty. Joran agreed to keep the ledger and stand watch. Mara for brass gloves to test textures at the rim. Devra insisted on keeping the token phrased in a private voice. The archivist closed his folio for a moment and looked at the burned ring on Mara's palm. He rubbed at the smear and left a faint crescent on the page. He felt the shift in himself. Suspicion had become responsibility, then anger at his own push for data, then a decided resolve to bind method to restraint. Those emotional shifts moved him into action rather than paralyzed him. He set the pen down and spoke with calm force. "We will not make the aperture a toy of curiosity," he said. "We will record and we will practice restraint. We will test with named absence only and never use curious eyes as probes. We will file the methods in triplicate and send a copy to the provincial keep. We will set guards. Bren, you choose the rotation. Devra, you keep the token. Mara, you supervise safety checks." Joran Ledger hands moved to accept tasks. No one cheered. They only aligned themselves into a workaday machinery that would minimize risk. The air held a thin hunger of unresolved questions. The archivist returned to his tent and wrote a clean entry, itemizing the event. 1 collapse, 1 ash smear, 1 burned ring, 1 loss of seconds, angles of mirror reflection, and Devra's confession. He did not permit himself long self-accusation. He recorded decisions in the folio and numbered the procedures. Before he closed the folio, he added one more note. A cross-reference to the ledger he had seen in the distant library, a notation tied to the sealed boy at a festival whose names had overlapped. He penciled a line connecting the two events with the same mechanical hand he used for measurements. The link made the aperture less an anomaly and more an instrument shaped by attention and naming. He tucked the folio beneath his arm and stood. Morning light slanted across the camp and hit the shutter that sealed the aperture. The shutter lay closed now, bolted and smelling of hot metal. He walked to the rim, ran his fingers along the edge, and felt a residual chill where the black had pressed against stone. He inhaled and exhaled slowly. The chapter closed on a concrete decision. The archivist lifted the small wrapped bundle that Devra had left beside the folio, a second token etched with a different ring, and wrote a single line beneath it. "Proceed with named restraint." He placed the bundle into the satchel at his hip, closed the tent flap, and walked toward the shutter as if to stand watch. His steps were measured. He had chosen a path that would tie scholarship to ritual caution. He would reopen the question, but only with a plan he could record and defend. Outside, someone hammered a bolt into the shutter. The sound landed like a verdict. The folio under the archivist's arm thudded against his chest. He set his jaw and looked up at the circle of black sealed behind metal. He would return to it. He would not let it take anyone without a name that matched the intent. He would also not let it remain an unmeasured threat. He walked back to the tent and lit a wick, then bent over his folio to write the first long entry of the morning. The sky above the observatory split into a black circle and Mara staggered forward, her hand clawing the rim until the archivist's fingers closed on her sleeve. Suspicion tightened the archivist's jaw. He had expected oddities at the aperture, but not a section of sky that swallowed dusk like a shutter. He shoved Mara back and barked, "Mara, hold. Get your footing." His voice was low and hard, the field coat heavy against his chest. Workers along the rim froze with torches half raised. The foreman shouted to pull everyone back. The immediate conflict was uncompromising. The aperture's reach had extended upward and had almost taken a woman. The archivist moved first because suspicion had driven him from the start. He had read about sealed chambers and odd alignments, but he had not read that sky could tear or tug. He dragged Mara behind a stone bollard and inspected her hand. Her knuckles were pale, a shallow abrasion circled her wrist where a leather strap had been torn. "Mara, tell me exactly what you felt," he said. He kept his sentences short. He kept his hands steady. Mara pressed her palm to the rim and exhaled with small, broken breaths. It pulled like a strap-tightening archivist. My shoulder, then my bones felt light as if something tried to lift them through my skin. She blinked, eyes bright with moisture. It went black above. Like someone cut out the stars, her voice pitched up on the last words. She used the word cut because the darkness had clean edges. Around the rim, men argued in quick bursts. The foreman pointed at the shutter mechanism. "Seal it now," he said. "We close the mouth, we finish the wall, and we go home." No more of this. Joran, who had been steady through earlier shocks, rubbed his temple and muttered, "We built it to see. Not to be seen by it, his mouth tightened. He kept his distance from the aperture. The archivist's suspicion shifted to calculation. He pulled his brass monocle from its chain and set it on the rim. The metal was cool, and his thumb left a small smear of oil on the rim's edge. He thought of the earlier days, when a slab rolled away and the lantern fell silent. He remembered the lamp vanishing into black in Chapter 2 and Joran going slack at the rim in Chapter 3. Those events had been recorded in his folio. He flipped the folio open with a practiced thumb and read the first line he de-scrawled at the sight. Aperture resists light. That concrete note guided his next moves. The workers' fear pushed the conversation into a staccato dispute.
Seal it!
The foreman repeated, no amount of measuring will save a man if that opening reaches for him. The archivist, we record first, we set theodolites. We measure what it does when we probe it. The foreman barked back, measure while your friend disappears. The words landed in the air like a thrown stone. Emotion shifted from suspicion to urgency as a gust like a room emptied of sound hit the rim, cold against exposed skin. The archivist kept his hand on Mara's shoulder to prove to himself she was still there. He directed Joran to fetch the brass theodolite while he organized torches and ropes. He spoke in short commands. Joran rigged the theodolite at the rim. Mara, hold the rope around your waist and brace the ground. Foreman, put 2 men on each rope. The men complied with the bluntness of people who understood practical orders. They set the theodolite with clumsy fingers. Mirrors and etched runes caught the low light. The archivist angled the instrument and peered through the monocle while Joran turned a fine screw until the crochet centered on the black circle above. When the mirror faced the void, the brass on theodolite seemed to lose its highlight. Cracks of reflected light folded away. The instrument revealed response. The etched runes darkened, and a faint reverberation passed through the metal. The theodolite's mirror shifted by a millimeter, though no hand had moved it. Joran exhaled hard. It moves when we try to measure it, he said. It reacts. The archivist, not passive. It answers. He felt the first hard prickle of fear, not for himself, but for the men who obeyed him. He ordered measurements with clipped entries. Angles, time, wind direction, rope tension. He wrote numbers into his folio with ink that smelled of iron. He tested mirrors, moved the instrument away, and watched the brass return color as if freed from a pressure. At the edge of the platform, a stranger climbed the stone steps. The man wore a hooded coat and moved with a gait that carried no surprise. He set a wrapped folio against the steps and spoke with a voice that did not tremble. You cannot measure what answers. You close it, or it takes more than men. He did not introduce himself. The arrival altered the group's balance. The foreman spat. Who are you? The stranger did not flinch. Someone who cares that your seal does not kill the land. Open the folio and read. Mara hesitated. The archivist's suspicion tightened again. New people meant new motives. Yet the folio's leather had a familiar smell, oiled hide and a faint trace of incense. The archivist unwrapped the pages. Inside were diagrams and instructions in a cramped exact hand. A line read, bind absence to living anchor. The sentence named concrete cost. It did not speak in metaphors. It that to seal the aperture Sreech would require either a living anchor or a memory surrendered. The archivist traced the ink with his finger. The letters were precise. He read aloud to Mara, close, bind to living or memory. Joran hissed, anchor. Do you mean sacrifice? The hooded stranger's jaw twitched. A binding that uses life will fasten the absence where you place it. A binding that uses memory will fracture a name until it is empty. He folded his hands. Either choice moves the absence. Neither destroys it, the foreman said. We will not choose blood. Not for stones. He glared at the stranger. Negotiations hardened into a bargain. Joran stepped forward and lifted his chin. He had been steady before. Now he spoke with an odd calm. I'll do it. I'll be the anchor. The foreman started to protest, then checked his voice when Joran looked at him full on. Joran, the foreman said, you volunteer. But I need assurance you will be tended. We don't hand a man to a hole without tether and witnesses. The language was practical. The bargaining was about preserves and promises. Joran answered in short sentences. I know the rope. I know the measure. Let me be the anchor and you promise safe pull. Back if it goes wrong. The foreman exchanged a look with Mara and the archivist. Mara's hand tightened on the rope. The archivist felt the second emotion shift, from urgency to the tremor of moral pressure. He could order measurements, but this choice was not his alone. He listened as men negotiated rope knots, the number of witnesses, and the exact wording of the foreman's guarantee. They set the central platform with ritual precision because the folio demanded specifics. Joran scrubbed his palms on his coat, steadied the shutter mechanism with gloved hands, and checked the rope around his waist. The archivist inspected the mechanism, then wrote a final line in his folio, ritual shutter. Lifeline attached. He read the instruction aloud as a check, lower at count 3. Do not let go. He watched Joran's jaw work under faint stubble. When Joran began to lower the shutter, the aperture answered with a tense hush that pulled at their breath. The air became viscous near the rim. The torch's flames lengthened and flickered toward the void. Joran's boots scraped the stone as the mechanism shuddered. He grunted and eased the weight, but the first tug seized him and his shoulders went forward. The rope burned against his palm hold. The foreman shouted. Mara planted both feet and held the tether. The archivist planted his shoulder and wrapped his gloves around the crank. Joran's mouth opened in a short sound, then he let out, it's pulling. The sound cut into a half sentence, and the gravity of the moment bit news into the workers' faces. The pull increased. Metal groaned. Joran was pulled until his torso leaned over the aperture and his boots lifted an inch from the stone. His eyes flicked to the black where the theodolite's crochet had been, and he bared his teeth. Archivist, he said in a breath. The archivist dropped his hand to Joran's sleeve and felt the ring of pale skin already forming where the void had touched him. The archivist's fingers curled into the leather. He felt the second major choice of the night. Yank Joran back and risk the shutter failing to close, or let the shutter snap and risk losing Joran's arm or more. He chose the pull. He did not think of sacrifice in words. He thought of the man's bones and of the workers who would go home at night. He fell back, planted his feet, and hauled with the foreman and 2 others on the rope until Joran's weight slackened. Joran slid back a handspan from the rim. His breath came in a rough laugh that had no humor. The shutter dipped, and the last inch of aperture sealed with a metal snap that echoed like a gunshot. For a long single moment no one spoke. Joran sat back on the stone with his knees trembling. The archivist scanned his hand and found a pale ring of skin around Joran's wrist where the void had brushed him, skin that had not been there an hour before. Joran flexed his fingers and hissed, "It took something from me where it touched." He held his hand up to show the ring. Then the hooded stranger was gone. The folio lay open on the steps where they'd read it. Someone swore softly. Mara looked toward the valley and saw a thin dark patch on the horizon, smaller than the aperture but distinct. The archivist's suspicion returned, colder and more precise. Whatever they desealed had moved. He closed the folio with a flat hand and checked Joran's pupils with the monocle. They were focused but distant on one corner of the sight. He wrote in his folio with a hand that did not shake, shutter closed, anchor scar, new void horizon. The words were plain. The immediate stabilization felt like carpentry after an accident. The shutter latched, ropes coiled, torches knotted into stands. Men vomited into the grass. Mara vomited once and then steadied herself on the rim. The foreman barked orders about tending Joran and securing the site. The conversation turned sharp and tactical. "We must mark the horizon patch and report," the foreman said. "We cannot leave a second mouth open where people walk." Joran lifted his wrist and turned the ring toward the light. It was a pale circle of skin, depressed like a shallow bruise but not tender. He tested his fingers and then, in a voice smaller than before, said, "I remember the bell in my father's workshop. He used to wind it at dusk." He the sentence as if recalling a fact, not describing a feeling. That discovery altered how the archivist read the folio. A living anchor had a cost. A memory anchor might steal recollection or reassign it. If Joran carried an involuntary memory, an old bell, the absence might have attached to a concrete image rather than to a life. The archivist felt a twist of responsibility. He had pulled Joran back. He had chosen to risk nothing and to risk everything. He had also chosen to keep the folios line about binding the memory from public recording. He hesitated, then omitted that sentence when he copied the day's notes into the folios margins. He wrote the empty circle pendant symbol and kept the last line for himself. They tended Joran through the pre-dawn. Mara pressed a cloth to his wrist while the foreman sent 2 men to mark the horizon patch with charcoal and banners. The archivist watched their faces. The foreman's jaw slackened at night. Mara's hands trembled but her voice stayed direct. Joran stared at the coiling ropes as if they were new maps. Conversation flowed in short bursts. Joran, do you hear the bell now? Mara. She spoke his name to anchor him. Yes, Joran, it's plain as when I was a child. I can see the shop, I can see the crank, but I cannot say the bell's maker's name, it will not come. His tone was flat, precise. He tested his memory like someone touching an object in the dark. The archivist closed a paragraph in the folio under his breath, and then unrolled the stranger's folio again with new intent. The diagrams had stippled lines showing the aperture's geometry and a note. Where absence is bound, a presence changes. Memory loses label or life yields tether. The sentence matched Joran's missing name. The archivist felt the next emotional shift, suspicion to anger at the epistemic theft. He spoke quietly so the tent did not carry sound. If a name is taken for a seal, the man keeps images but not identity. That is theft of narrative. He did not use the word, theft, emotionally. He used it as a technical term. Mara watched him and then asked, then Joran kept a thing but lost the label. Can that be returned? Her fingers tightened on the cloth. The archivist considered controlled experiments and the ethics of unbinding. He thought of the hooded stranger vanishing. He thought of the pale ring. He weighed options with numbers and ritualese. At dawn the group convened a quick council. The foreman wanted to reinforce the shutter and build a wall. We will not host the thing again, he said. We close it and record that it is closed. Mara. We must know whether the horizon patch is the same danger. Joran rubbed the ring and said, if the absence moved, we followed it. If it moved, that means this site is linked to the valley. The archivist wrote down their aims. Secure shutter, map horizon, decide whether to trace or to abandon. The archivist had one more private act. He took the empty circle pendant from his satchel and sat beneath a dim lamp in his tent. His fingers smelled of ink and old paper. He had the option to leave the folio as official record or to keep a line hidden. He wrote the full ritual wording on a separate page and then, when he would have normally sealed that page into the folio, he tore the corner that contained the instruction about memory binding and tucked it beneath his palm. He did not call it moral calculus. He counted it as a choice with outcomes. He slid the pendant into his palm and tightened his grip around it until the brass ridges bit into his skin. Outside, the tent workers walked the perimeter and pressed flags into the earth where the horizon patch had been seen. The archivist listened to boots on stone and to faint, distant birds finding morning light. He traced Joran's name back to the old entry, where a line had been crossed out when the theodolite first reacted. He had to decide whether to follow the absence or to watch it from a distance. He felt the obligation to record and the urge, call it the same suspicion that had driven him from the start, to learn where the absence had come from and why a people had built a structure to bind it in the first place. Mara approached archivist. She said, if it moves, will you go after it? She was careful. The question was concrete. He looked at Joran's ring, then at the pendant in his coat. He answered with a precise sentence, I will follow the trail. I'll keep the folio's public entries clear and carry the rest with me. His voice did not rise. He removed the pendant from his hand and traced the empty circle he scraped into the brass with a fingernail. Mara nodded once. Then I come with you, she said. Her choice arrived not as speech but in action. She slotted a service knife into her belt and tightened the rope around her waist as if preparing for road. The archivist registered the decision and felt a small, cold relief. He had not expected a volunteer, yet volunteers changed plans. The foreman muttered about leaving, but made no protest when Mara signed herself to accompany the archivist in a log entry. Before they left, the archivist made a final, deliberate record. He sat on the tent's low cot, opened his folio, and wrote 3 lines visible to others. The shutter closed, the anchor scar, and the horizon patch marked. He underlined those lines. Under a separate fold he wrote the binding instruction and placed a waxed scrap over it. He did not read the scrap aloud. He fastened the pendant inside his coat and stepped down the stone steps to the rim, where the men waited. At the rim, Joran gripped the rope and stared toward the dark patch on the horizon. "Don't forget the bell maker's face," he said in a voice that carried a request rather than an order. "If you find what moved, call it by the name he would use." The archivist met his eyes and felt that name, shaped absence in himself like a hole with a particular edge. He answered plainly, "I will try." He could not promise more. They walked down the stone steps with the pendant hidden against the archivist's ribs. Men packed tools. The foreman posted men to watch the sealed aperture all day. The hooded stranger did not return. The horizon patch remained a thin black cut against morning sky, flagged and noted but not touched. The archivist kept his face steady. He felt the final emotional turn, acceptance threaded with resolve. He had moved from suspicion to urgency to moral pressure, and now to a measured determination that would guide his next step. Before sunrise he wrote one last private line and etched a small empty circle in the margin, an emblem for his vow. He then closed the folio, slid the pendant into a small pocket under the folio, and wrapped the folio with a leather strap. He did not announce his secret. He walked down the path that led from the observatory toward the valley, where the dark patch waited like a question with edges. As he descended, Mara at his side and Joran watching from the rim, the archivist felt the weight of what they'd done. A shutter closed, a man bearing a ring that kept a bell, but lost a maker's name, a stranger vanished, and a new absence opened on the horizon. He had bound the day's events into ink. The final act of the night was concrete and visible. The pendant's circle impressed into the folio page, the pendant warming in his palm, and his foot stepping off the final stone toward the path that led out of the observatory. He walked down with the folio tight against his chest and the pendant under his shirt, and the chapter ended with him lowering his head against the cold wind and stepping toward the valley.